Muslims are just people like us. They are created in the image of God. When I was in Australia, I realized that, many Australian Christians perceive and even consider Muslim migrants as threats. And there is a sense of fear. Muslims are our brothers and sisters.
This is Out of the Margins podcast.
The podcast space, especially in the Christian world, is saturated by Western voices. But if we want a diversity of thought to face the future together, we need to step back and hear voices from out of the margins.
Here, we will be offering insights from experiences and perspectives from the majority world. My name is Edgar.
And I'm Simon.
And on each episode, we will be bringing to you our conversations with pastors, leaders, and scholars from the majority world.
This podcast is brought to you by Young Langham Australia.
Welcome to another episode of the Out of the Margins podcast.
It's absolutely fabulous to be with you here for another week, Edgar.
It's good to be with you, Simon. This week, we are talking about engaging with Islam. So, can you tell us a little bit about the why of this topic?
So one of the things that we really want to do as a podcast, part of what we want to do is as young people and as Christians who are thinking globally, is to start thinking about what it would look like to engage with other religions. So the first topic that we're going to look at is how we can engage with our Muslim neighbours. Islam is the second largest religion in the world and the fastest growing. So it is pretty clear that we are going to start engaging more with Muslims as time goes on in our own society. But it's also just important to know what's going on around the world as Christians engage with Muslims. So it's a really fantastic opportunity, and I'd really encourage you to open up your minds and your hearts as we continue on.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't had the opportunity to engage as much with Muslims, to be honest. And I would love to hear from experts, from people who are on the field, like people who are actually engaging with Muslims, to hear from their own experiences and how to do this in the best way.
Well, you are in luck, Edgar, because we have two absolutely fantastic Langham Scholars that I spoke to recently. The first of our guests today is Anwar Berhe. He's an Ethiopian Langham Scholar who studied here in Australia and graduated in December 2019. He's now the academic dean at a Bible college in Ethiopia, as well as doing a myriad of other things, which you will find out soon are just mind-blowing in service of the gospel. And the other, just as amazing, is Dr. Aldrin Penamora. He earned his PhD in Christian ethics from Fuller Theological Seminary, California, USA, but he lives and works and does his ministry in the Philippines, where he's from. And he is another fantastic Langham scholar who is doing amazing work for peacemaking and Muslim-Christian relations around the world.
Oh, wow. That sounds great. I can't wait to hear the conversation.
Yeah, fantastic. Why don't we get straight into it?
Awesome. Let's do that.
Let's hear now what Anwar Berhe, an ex-Muslim and prolific evangelist to Muslims, not just in Africa, but in the Middle East as well, has to say about what it means to be a Christian in open interfaith dialogue with our Muslim peers. To give some quick context, this interview was recorded early in 2023, so any references to an ongoing civil conflict in Ethiopia are outdated.
My name is Anwar Berhe, and I'm living in Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia. And my ministry is I am involving in the Evangelical Theological College, and I'm also serving in a local church. I'm academic dean for undergraduate program in Evangelical Theological College. And I'm also heading the Christian-Muslim relation program in master's levels. And actually, I'm teaching Christian-Muslim relation courses and mission courses at the college. And in my local church, I am involving in leadership. I am the chair of the board of trustees in our local church, and involving in teaching, preaching, discipleship, and church planting activities. So, yeah. I'm doing those things. Yeah.
That sounds like a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah.
So, can you tell us a little bit about the story of how you came to be where you are today? How did you become a Christian?
Actually, I grew up in a Muslim family. Actually, my family were living in a Muslim community, and there were very few Christians. So I grew up in a mosque setting. I went to the mosque and I was practicing Muslim, and I grew up in that way. But when I went to secondary school, I went to another town, and actually I met some Christians, believing Christians, and Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, Catholics. So that gave me an opportunity to interact with Christians. But I was so resistant because, when I was a child, my dad told me, don't be friends with Christian, and they are infidels, they are kafir, they are impure. Because of this, I was actually very cautious about Christians. But when I was grade 10 student, God encountered me through dream. So that dream led me to inquire Christ and to discuss with Christians, to debate with Christians. So it took me almost 3 years of debating and discussing with Christians. But finally, I realized Jesus is my savior, and I came to the Lord that way.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So after conversion, of course, there was persecution from my family and my friends. Yeah. But God helped me to stand firm in that situation.
Fantastic. And then what brought you into ministry? That's a big jump from not believing to doing all the amazing things for the kingdom that you are now. What brought you there?
When I came to Christ, I was in university. I was a university student when I accepted Christ. Then I finished my studies and I went back home, and I got a job. I was working in an organization called Goal Ethiopia, Third World Relief and Development Organization. So while I was working there, so God spoke to my heart to give my full time for ministry in the church. So I shared my calling and my passion to my church leaders. And finally, my church leader says, okay, this is good. We are very happy. And actually, they checked my calling and my background and all these things. They say, okay, just join us. But their fear was, we will not pay you much. You are living a very lucrative job. And, when you came to the church, you will have financial hardship, they said. But I said, no, just God is my provider. So God will provide me. I will serve the church. Finally, the church leaders discussed and sent me to theological college. I studied Bachelor of Theology for 4 years. And when I finished that study, my church invited me to start a Muslim outreach program in the national office of my denomination.
Wow.
It's a big responsibility.
Yes.
So So I established this Muslim outreach program in the national office. That was a new program. And then I worked in that program actually for 10 years. In that capacity, I was training pastors, church leaders, missionaries, church planters, disciple makers, educators, in lower level and middle level. And I was also supervising and mentoring church planting activities in Muslim areas all over the country. So the situation gave me more opportunities to interact with Muslims and with Muslim converts and with church planting activities. So, yeah, actually in that ministry, God blessed us enormously, and more than 30,000 Muslims came to Christ and many churches were planted. Yeah, so that's how I involved in that ministry for 10 years.
Yeah.
But when I was serving in that ministry, actually I studied my master's degree and Master of Theology degrees in order to equip myself to address the needs, actually the training needs, the writing needs of the church in Ethiopia. Yeah.
Okay, so you went all the way to PhD level. You sort of addressed that a little bit, but it sounds like you were able to do a lot of amazing things with your bachelor level degree. Why go into postgraduate study?
Yeah, actually, when I was serving in the national office, I involved in, as I said, in lower and middle level. But the increasing number of Muslim converts and the increasing number of people who have passion to reach out Muslims, there was no higher level of training.
Okay.
So some of them got this middle and lower level training. So now they want more training. Those who want to write, those who want to train others and even do research and be a missionary abroad in other contexts like Middle East countries, North Africa, Asia, and other places. So actually the demand of the church, the ministry by itself, pushed me to actually seek PhD studies to equip myself, to improve my writing skills, research skills, critical thinking skills, and my teaching skills. So that's why I went to Australia to study PhD. And after I came back, I started this Master of Arts in Christian-Muslim Relation program.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So a little bit more about the Christian-Muslim relations. That's, just very interesting to me. That's you've become somewhat of an expert in that. Your thesis was on that. What about that particularly captures your heart?
Especially my thesis is focused on interreligious harmony. In that, why I am interested in that is, Muslims and Christians lived in Ethiopia almost for 1,400 years together side by side. But in recent years, there is a challenge. In some Muslim Christian areas, Muslims and Christians are engaged in conflict and there are tensions rising. But in other areas, Muslims and Christians are living in harmony, peacefully, side by side, as a family. Even I myself, I have Muslim families, my sisters, my brothers. So we are living in harmony. So I want to understand what are the factors behind for interreligious relationships. So those interreligious harmony and interreligious relationships influence even Muslim ministry. When we engage with Muslims, those are very important to understand. So that's why I want to focus on studying interreligious relations. And also when I start my master's program, this master's program is very important and strategic for Ethiopian churches. The reason is there are 35 million Muslims in Ethiopia. Imagine, it's more than Australian population. Yeah. So it is also surrounded by Muslim countries like Somalia and Sudan, Eritrea, and across the Red Sea, just in almost some 100 miles away, there is the Middle East countries and North African countries. So, the location of Ethiopia is both a challenge for Ethiopian churches at the same time, an opportunity for Ethiopian churches.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that, if we are idle and if we do not, reach out Muslims, the Muslim influence comes to Ethiopia and the church will be challenged.
Mm.
On the other side, Ethiopia has lots of connection with the Middle East and Muslim countries in terms of culture, in terms of political relationships, in terms of historical ties, in terms of migration of Ethiopian workers to the Middle East. So because of this, we want to start this program. So we started Master of Arts in Christian Muslim Relations in 2020 after I came from Australia. And now 10 students graduated from this program so far. And we have 32 students who are in study now. And some of them are actually aspiring to go to Middle East countries.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, one of our graduates went to Tunisia. He is a missionary over there now.
Yeah.
And the other two are now planning to go to Middle East country as a missionary.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so that shows how it's very connected. Ethiopia is connected with the Middle East countries.
Yes.
And even today, two of our students are living in Muslim countries. One is in Somalia, the other one is in Algeria. They are, working there, tent makers, and they are studying this program.
They're tent makers. That's very, that's cool.
This program is very crucial for Ethiopian churches, to train more people for Ethiopian churches, at the same time to reach out more Muslims in the Middle East and other Muslim countries.
Fantastic. And so, I mean, you talked about an astounding number of Muslims who have converted to Christianity in Ethiopia, and this mission to Muslims in the Middle East. How do you approach evangelism with your Muslim neighbors?
Actually, we are using different approaches based on the context. Context matters, The reason is in some contexts, you may use some kind of approach. In other contexts, you may use another kind of approach. So far, we are using mainly one-to-one friendship approach in evangelism. When you get two or more Muslims together, if one Muslim is interested to listen about the gospel, the other Muslim guy, he is his brother's keeper. So this guy is afraid of listening the word of God, the other brother. So because of this, we focus on one-to-one evangelism. And that is very effective in Ethiopian context. The other one is social media. We are using social medias like TikToks, Facebooks, websites. So we are using those medias, especially for young people. Young people are so interested with this social media. So we are also reaching out Muslims in that way. Actually, two of my in the master's program, their ministry is mainly focused on social media.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So
that's very interesting.
They have websites and they are actually engaging with Muslims with lots of questions. They do lots of discussions, and they led many Muslims to Christ through social media. Yeah. The other one is, especially in Muslim majority context, in rural area, what we do is we actually go there, or our missionaries go there and find a man of peace or a woman of peace. That means a person who is interested to listen to the word of God.
Okay.
So once you get one person, so we start a fellowship in that person's home. So we start house fellowship. So through that person, we reach out, the neighboring community through friendships, through family networks, and through neighborhood networks. So we are using networks rather than doing mass evangelism and campaign. That doesn't work in Muslim context.
Yeah.
So that's how we are reaching out to Muslims.
I love that. That's very early church. That sounds very Acts to me. I like that a lot. So that's fantastic.
I think so much.
So you're also involved in the Love and Mercy ministry there in Ethiopia. Can you tell us a bit more about what that ministry does and what's the heart behind it?
Yeah, actually, we are doing this ministry, especially after we came from Australia.
Mm-hmm.
We learned this ministry actually from Crossway Baptist Church. We were member of Crossway Baptist Church, and we actually learned from Crossway. It's a holy plagiarism, plagiarism, right?
Yeah.
It's a holy one.
Yeah.
Every month, Crossway Baptist Church collects money and other foodstuffs and other things for needy people in the community.
Mm-hmm.
When we were a member over there, I and my wife discussed, and this is a very interesting idea. It's a good ministry. We have to go back to our country and we have to start this kind of ministry in our church.
Yeah.
So after we came back, we, actually introduced this idea to our church. I was elected as chairman of board of trustees, and then I shared my team leaders, and they say, okay, this is a very good idea. So let's collect money and food and other things every month on the day of Holy Communion and distribute to needy people in our community, in our church and in the community at large. So we started that ministry that way. And my wife was also assigned as chair of that ministry. Mm-hmm. So she is running that ministry in our local church. So every month we collect the foods and other things and distribute, especially single women who have children. They suffer a lot. We distribute money and food. And the other thing is, there are children, school children, who are from poor family. So we collect educational materials and money for school uniforms and even for scholarship for their kids. Yeah. So we raise funds from the local church and we support those children. Actually, through that ministry, many people also came to Christ who are believers before. Yeah. So it's incredible. The reason is, we have to share the gospel in a practical way. Yeah. We have to share the love of Christ practically and holistically. Mm-hmm. Just we cannot share just the word only. That's the reason behind why we are doing the Christian love ministry.
Fantastic. I mean, it sounds like God has blessed you in a myriad of ways, and it sounds like you're doing many wonderful things. Though, what can we be praying for you for? What challenges have you been facing in your ministry there in Ethiopia?
Yeah, there are lots of challenges, but I want to point just 3 of them, which are very important. The first one is persecution, especially when we plant church in new areas. We face persecution. The church is persecuted. Some new believers are, under attack. That is actually a continuous thing happening time to time in a rural setting, even in urban setting. That's happening. So that is one of the challenges that we appreciate if you pray for persecuted churches in our context, especially in Muslim context in Ethiopia. And the other challenge is security challenge. Because of this civil war in the past 3 years, there was a civil war in Ethiopia. Because of this, there is security challenge. Even sometimes, it was very difficult to live in Addis and to serve. Mm-hmm. We were somehow anxious, but it was difficult for us to leave our people behind and go to another country.
Yes.
So there were days which are very difficult, but these days is better. But when we travel to the countryside, still there are some conflicts between the government and armed forces here and there. So it becomes a challenge. So that is another challenge. The third one is, when we are involving in different ministries in our churches and even in church planting areas, lack of resource is another challenge for us. The demand is huge, the ministry is very big, but the resources we have here is limited. So sometimes we are short of some resources. So pray for us for resources, for security, and for persecution. Those are the main challenges to pray for.
Thank you very much. Now, one thing I was wondering, there is, a not insignificant Muslim population here in Australia. Obviously, it's much smaller than in Ethiopia. The suburb over from me is actually a majority Muslim population, but I often find that young evangelicals we don't interact with our Muslim neighbours at all. I've only really had any significant interaction with one person. What advice would you give to young people for reaching out to our Muslim neighbours?
Yeah, thank you so much. Muslims are just people like us. As a Christian, we have to think that way. Muslims are people like us. They are created in the image of God. And Muslims can listen us. They are actually religious people. They have a passion to know the truth. So we have to actually approach them in a friendly manner, with understanding that they can listen us and we can listen them. We can interact. They can be our friends. So friendship evangelism is very important. We have to be friends with them, and we have to build trust. That is actually the foundation for our interaction. So if we approach them in a friendly way, if we develop a relationship and trust, so we can start, sharing the gospel to Muslims. We should not afraid Muslims. They are just like people like us. I was a Muslim, right? I was a Muslim. Christians approached me and shared me the gospel, and that's why I became a Christian. So the Australian Muslims, even though they are migrants, they are people. They have values. They have, culture. They love others as well. So if we focus on relationship and if we have concern and love for them, it's easy to reach out Muslims in Australia.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah. You've spent a good amount of time studying here in Australia. What's one piece of advice you'd give young Christians here in the West?
When I was in Australia, I realized that, many Australian Christians perceive and even consider Muslim migrants as threats. And there is a sense of fear. What will happen tomorrow, right? Yes, Islam is a threat. Islam is a threat, but Muslims are our brothers and sisters. On the other side, there is a great opportunity that God brought to the Australian churches. If Australian Christians want to reach out Muslims, they have to go to Muslim countries. It's very difficult to go there and preach the gospel because of political reasons, legal reasons, visa, and other issues. But God brought Muslims to our neighborhood.
He sure did.
To share the gospel. They are eating our food, actually Australian food. They go to the same office or the same workplaces. They are living in the same suburb. In that context, it's become very easy to share the gospel to those Muslims. So this is an opportunity. It's not a threat. If the church pray for Muslims and engage with them and share the gospel boldly and by upholding biblical truths, so God brought opportunity for the Australian churches and even in the other Western countries. So this is up to the Australian churches to use it, especially young people. They can interact with those migrants easily. So that is an opportunity, and I want to advise young people to engage with Muslims, to use that opportunity for the glory of God.
That's really inspiring. Thank you so much, Anwar. And thank you so much for your time. My conversation with Aldrin Penamora will help us get a perspective on engaging with Islam from a very different context. Not only does Aldrin show us some of the ways that interfaith dialogues might be different in different geographical and ethnic regions, but it also shows us what it means to engage with Muslims who are a minority class. Here's Aldrin.
My full name is Aldrin Morada Peñamora, and I serve with the Philippine Council of Evangelical Churches. I serve as Executive Director of two commissions. Number one is the Justice, Peace, and Reconciliation Commission, which deals with things like Christian-Muslim relations or peacemaking with other groups, especially Muslims and communist insurgents and other, groups that we have conflict here in the Philippines. And I also serve as the Executive Director of the Theological Commission. And this is where we deal with theological matters, questions about doctrines. And then so this is my third hat. With the Philippine Council of Evangelical Churches, I serve as the Executive Director also of the Center for the Study on Christian-Muslim Relations, CSCMR. And as an aside, I teach at seminary and serve as a Program Director for the PhD in Peace Studies with the Asia Graduate School of Theology and the International Graduate School of Leadership. It's a consortium. I started serving as program director since last year. Yeah, so those are my main roles.
Fantastic. It sounds like you're doing a lot of really good work for the Kingdom of Heaven, which is wonderful. You mentioned in two parts of your ministry in which you're involved in Christian-Muslim relations, and that's what we want to talk about today. So I'm wondering, what does Muslim-Christian relations look like in your context there in the Philippines?
Here in our country, the relationship between Christians and Muslims has been colored by long history of conflict. And because when the Philippines was discovered in the 16th century, Muslims were already here in some parts of the country, especially in the southern Philippines. So that led to, with the colonization and then Christianity becoming the majority religion now in the Philippines. So that long history has led to conflicts throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and even in this current century. So much of it has been politicized, and there are just so many massacres and wars between the government represented by Christians or formed by a majority Christian population. So that has really, affected how Muslims and Christians view each other.
Yeah, sure. We might talk a little bit more about that further in the interview. I want to ask, what's your approach? I mean, there's a lot of, it seems to be there's a lot of difficulty and a lot of history there. So how do you approach being a Christian in that situation and speaking to your Muslim neighbors and interacting with them?
When I began, or one of my foundational experiences with Muslims here, is when our churches, we ministered to a group of Muslims who are street dwellers. And I think I served in that ministry for a few years, I think three years, and learned many things about their history, why they became, street dwellers and really, at the margins of society. And one of the causes that I learned from them is that they are even persecuted by their own, by some of their Muslim tribes.
Oh, wow.
And because they are, one of the poorest, because there are, several tribes that are Muslims. And so they are maybe the poorest, I think. And so I began to understand during that, early period, that was a late 1990s, early 2000s. And so I started even bringing some of them to, sick Muslims and their children to government hospitals, and knowing that they can't speak, native Filipino, Tagalog, or they're just shy. They are afraid to talk to, doctors and things like that because of that, of their status. So that began my journey and to ministering to Muslims. So I think I my approach is to try to see the human face in the Muslim person who I'm talking to, not just as a, try to unveil the religious aspect of, hey, you're a Muslim, I'm a Christian. We've had lots of baggages all throughout the centuries. I try to, remove that, that veil, so to speak, and try to speak to their situation. And I think that is my basic approach, is to find the humanity in the Muslim neighbor.
Yeah. Everyone is an image of God, aren't they? So I think that's really important. So this is a bit of a running thing in the podcast, and I'm quite curious to find this out. As a Filipino, how do you drink your tea?
I think, Simon, this is the most difficult question.
Tell me more.
Well, it's for me, it's really difficult because number one is that I seldom drink tea. So, but when I saw your question, this question, I was like thinking, wow, how do you drink tea?
Yeah.
I mean, I like the green tea.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had friends from abroad bringing me tea from Nepal and also from Sri Lanka or Ceylon.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, those are very nice tea, they said. And I did find it, quite really tasteful and really good. So, but, blowing over, when it's hot, blowing over, just drinking it, you're boiling it. So that's it. I think I'm not an expert here. So.
well, the big debate is between the Indian style and the Chinese style. Of like the Chinese style, it's the just water and you just put boiling water into the tea, and then you sort of steep it with different kinds of things. And then the Indian style, that's the lots and lots of milk and then lots and lots of spices and that sort of thing. And so we found that sort of Southeast Asia, it's really big on the Chinese style, but then Africa, big influence on the Indian style. So it's been really interesting, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you're right. I mean, I think the Chinese style is more prevalent here. I think the Thai style is similar to, as you said, to the Indian with milk. But I mean, here in the Philippines, when you go to a restaurant, they'd serve you, or a Chinese restaurant, it's often just, tea, boiling water. So I think that's my style too.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Now I learned a lot.
So you already said you're the executive director for the Center of the Study of Christian-Muslim Relations as part of the Philippine Council of Evangelical Churches. Can you tell us just a little bit more about what you do there?
Sure. Well, mostly because this is not just Philippine, it is based here in the Philippines, but we have members from, it's a small group of researchers based in, of course, myself from the Philippines. And then I have other couple of colleagues here also in the Philippines, including Bishop Ephraim Tendero. We have research members or core members from Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. So these are the core countries where we are doing research work. It's not really it's not mainly academic, but we try to, from these countries, we do research on the growth of Islam and monitor the development, especially Islamization or political Islam, because as we know, there is a growth. Political Islam is growing worldwide, especially in Southeast Asia, so that many minorities, Christians, their rights are being curtailed, things like that. They aren't able to practice the freedom of religion, although constitutionally the country may say that they have that. So we try to help churches in the region develop also national networks and organize and facilitate training so that they can better engage their Muslim neighbors, so that as I mentioned a while ago, the relationship will not turn into hostility or as history has shown. So basically we try to help churches by researching the growth of political Islam and how the churches can navigate those those dynamics in their own context, especially in the countries where I mentioned that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so basically that's how we operate.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The political aspect is something that I hadn't really considered. So that's that's really interesting. I'm wondering, this sort of question came from the position that I think there are some people, perhaps in the church here in Australia, who feel like interacting with Muslims is perhaps a dangerous thing, or they sort of balk at the concept of an interfaith dialogue. It sounds like, we're weakening our own faith or something like that. From your perspective, do you think there's a good theological basis for Christians to have a greater interaction with our Muslim neighbors?
Yeah, we at the CSCMR and in the other commission, Justice, Peace, Reconciliation Commission, where we also have we organize dialogues and interfaith activities with Muslims. I think one of the theological basis for what we do is, as you mentioned it a while ago, about the concept of neighbor, and I think in the Luke 10 parable on the Good Samaritan, where the expert of the law actually asked Jesus about who is my neighbor. The concept of neighbor here is really, I think, relevant, because when Jesus answered about the Good Samaritan, he was also drawing from the Leviticus 19, the law holiness code in Leviticus 19, where both the love of neighbor is mentioned, and then later on in the same chapter, it was expanded to loving the foreigner. So that meaning of neighbor is not just within the community, but they are to love their neighbor as themselves, because they were foreigners too once in Egypt. And God, Yahweh, was saying there that, this is part of what it means to be holy, is that you are to love your neighbor. And Jesus expanded on that in Matthew 5 also about, loving your enemies. So I think that idea of a neighbor is, there's a tendency for us to just look at our own communities, but the revolutionary or the radical teaching of Jesus is really about loving your enemies, those who are not like you. So for Christian-Muslim relations, where they're, in conflict situations, this is a very crucial teaching. It's just revolutionary. So as I mentioned earlier too, that when I began to bring sick Muslims to the hospitals here in the Philippines, I think, that humanity, seeing the other person not as an enemy, not as a Muslim, but just as a fellow person in the image of God, needing this and needing that, having that space for the other. I think that's what being neighbor is all about. I think that's what Jesus is teaching us, is to have that space for those who are different from others, because they are actually, created in the same image as we are.
Truly, that's early teaching in the Bible is such a radical concept, even still today. It's amazing.
Yeah, right.
And you talked about the story of the Good Samaritan. I think that we can really, there's a remarkable number of similarities between the way that first century Israelites were thinking of Samaritans and some of the ways that we think as Christians of Muslims today. So, yeah, I think that's a really pertinent thing to bring up. So, in terms of the theology, it's trying to get at sort of the ethos and the logos of the argument for Christian-Muslim relations. But let's talk pathos. We've talked from a theological perspective. Tell me personally, what drew you specifically to want to devote so much time and energy to this project?
course, my context is very much relevant. And in our context here in the Philippines, we have found Muslims as we have perceived them as enemies. And I think when I initially had that experience with them, and I formed close friendships with some of those street dwellers and learned their stories about their situation and their persecution. So that just opened up my eyes that perceptions and our prejudices, when we don't have a deeper understanding of the other, we just tend to rely on those initial reactions. Hey, Muslims are like this, they're terrorists, they are, and in the Philippines they are seen as traitors, they are seen as kidnappers, because of social media too. So I think that's why I am very big on immersion and on knowing the other, knowing their situation. This is in my classes also. I teach that that if we are to do social engagement, we should have some immersion. We have to have the experience of really talking to the other or to the others. Without that, I think it will be difficult to lessen the barriers or the prejudices. So we need to, as I mentioned, we need to see the human face. We need to talk to the human person, not just an idea.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, there's a lot of compassion needs to occur in that kind of thing. It's like, to divorce the concepts that we have about Muslims from the person who's sitting in the street and needs our help. I think really we've tackled a lot of this particular question, but if some of our listeners are still a little bit trepidatious about engaging with Muslims, whether it's about a fear of hostility or cultural expectations or simply not really knowing what to say, could you tell me some of the challenges that you've faced in your work with engaging with your Muslim neighbors and how you've overcome them?
Well, cultural distinctives are real, of course. Muslims, although they have a Islamic way of looking at things, still particular cultures or Muslims in particular communities will have their distinctive cultural ways. So I think navigating culture is one. So, for example, in the Philippines, even when I was talking to Muslims, just riding with them in a public transportation in southern Philippines, where they are a majority, I have found, they would feel, knowing that I'm not Muslim, so they would. So I have even experienced being, some men trying to push me out.
Oh wow!
Of the seat, of the public vehicle, and then in one area, I was trying to get a cab, and some Muslim men were not trying to give me a space in the cab, because here you share cabs in southern Philippines.
Yeah.
So I have those are hostilities. I think that culturally, of course, they look at me as a Christian, a land grabber, because there's the history of land grabbing Christians on Muslim lands. So they have that perception. So what's helpful to me is that some Muslim friends, introduced by common Christian friends, they accompanied me to Muslim communities, to Muslim, where I want to go in southern Philippines to do my research during the time. And so having a Muslim person explaining to me and becoming my guide, sort of, to visit mosques, visit Islamic centers, that having someone like that would be very helpful. I think we can't simply just go to a Muslim community. In the Philippines, there's what we call a tagapamagitan in Tagalog, which is so someone that could mediate what you want to do to the community, I want to have dialogue with them, to know their religious leaders and a Muslim person. And this has been a constant theme in our initiatives with Muslims.
So that's a really interesting thing to know as Western Christians, thinking about how we might be able to engage with Muslims in our context. Something really specific to your context, and you've already spoken about this quite a bit. I get the understanding that it really pervades the whole sort of cultural understanding of these kinds of dialogues. The stain of colonialism casts a big shadow over the Filipino mind, and really, the colonial powers like Spain and America made a claim toward Christianity. So I imagine, and you have spoken fairly extensively about this already, about how that must affect your dialogue with Muslims and how they view Christians. Can you expand a little bit more about how that might have been a barrier in your situation?
That has been a huge barrier, especially before the establishment of the autonomous Muslim government in the South. That has been, when you read materials produced by our Islamic Muslim brothers and sisters, they would, they would narrate those colonial injustices and neo-colonial injustices fostered by our Philippine government, having that similar, colonialist design of grabbing their lands, their resources. So that has been a huge barrier, and that was one of the focal points that we wanted to address in our dialogues. Is to, of course, we cannot reverse what happened in the past, but we wanted to demonstrate in our dialogues, in our knowing them, that we're not doing this to gain further political or economic advantage, then that will further marginalize them. So as I mentioned, we even tried to, in my initial experiences of bringing them to the hospital. Later on, that a similar thing happened to us in our institution at the Philippine Council of Evangelical Churches, where in a very significant situation, because there was a war in the southern Philippines that drove Muslims out of their homes, and this is in Marawi, where the only Islamic city in the Philippines. It was bombed by the government because of the ISIS, the threat of the ISIS. A local ISIS movement attacked that city, and so there was a big battle. And I think this was 2017 and 18. And what we responded, the evangelicals responded by giving them aid, and then we even built houses for them. I think there are up to now they are still there, 120, livable houses. And during that time, the Muslims weren't, they were, going out of the city and going to a nearby town, and they weren't being accepted by the hotels. Many of them were sleeping in there. Some of our friends are even professional Muslims, lawyers, teachers, and they couldn't get a room in the hotels owned by Christians, because the Christians in that nearby town were afraid of them. So they had to live, in their cars, in the streets, it was really a terrible time for them. And so we responded by, partnering with other organizations. These are led by evangelicals, and 120 houses were built, and up to now, these are being occupied by Muslims who are homeless. So it's in a community. These aren't in a Christian community. These houses are in the Muslim community, also governed by overseen by Muslims and some of our Christian friends too.
Well, already you've brought us to a bit of a lighter note, which is fantastic. I'm sure that you've seen more successes over your extensive time working to make peace with your Muslim neighbors. Can you tell us some of the greatest successes that you have seen?
Back in when we began our dialogue with Muslims, I think it was 2015. This is part of the CSAMR and Philippine Council of Evangelical. We began first, with the grassroots, with the religious leaders in the community in Southern Philippines. And then that started, to develop into close friendships with these religious leaders up to now. We have maintained those friendships with key religious leaders and even those who are now in the government, in Southern, in the autonomous government. And that initial dialogue in 2015 led to further dialogues because we really need to be consistent in doing this. It's just not a one-time event. We journeyed with them, especially during the time that they are, trying to form this autonomous government. We journeyed with them, trying to understanding their positions, and even in the halls of Congress, we were joining them, promoting their rights, and the Philippine nation owed the Muslims in the South, and so in 2017, one of the successes that we had relationally was that we formed this memorandum of agreement this is with top Muslim rebel group during the time, which now Bangsamoro Autonomous Government legally, they're now not rebels anymore. And when we did the signing, it was in the main battle camp of that rebel group. So, it was highly publicized also in their side, and up to now, those groups, as I mentioned, many of them are in the parliament. And, when they see our evangelical group, they have this camaraderie that was born from journeying with them, not because they are powerful during the time, but because they were, actually they were still looking for, a representation in the national government. But we came alongside them, journeyed with them through thick and thin, as they say, and so the friendship has remained up to now. Even with the chief minister, we have wonderful relationship with Muslim leaders because of those, initiatives.
That's fantastic. That's such a good example of loving your enemy. I just think that's amazing. That was an amazing story. Thank you so much. So the crux of this podcast is that we want Western young people to have the opportunity to hear voices of people from the majority world. I think here in the Australian church, our relationships with our Muslim neighbours can be really fraught, or I think also just non-existent. I mean, there are definitely big Muslim communities here in Brisbane, but they're so cut off from us that we don't even speak to them at all. But we want to encourage our listeners to start thinking about what it would look like to be more open to start interfaith dialogues with Muslim people in our communities. So I want to ask you, what advice would you give Christians seeking to start engaging with our Muslim neighbours?
Well, I think it is important, first, I think, to have that open space within ourselves to be acceptance, to accept others. I think we are called to that, as Christians. When we share the gospel, only sometimes we tend to impose the gospel on others. But with Muslims, I think, and with knowing the history of Christian Muslims, not only in Australia, not only in the Philippines, but as a whole, that, there has been that history of, animosity. I think having in ourselves the open space is sort of like the father of the prodigal son, just, opening himself to whenever the son will return, just waiting. And then, I think we need that openness to accept and to know, to be interested really in the situation of our Muslim brothers and sisters, because in our experience, sincerity, in knowing them, what they believe in, what their situation is. And when they see that, that we're not here to, simply impose our religion or our Christianity, but we approach them with, real interest in knowing who they are as persons, as I mentioned, as penetrating the veil of being a Muslim, being a Christian, but just, being Amir, being an Ustad, whatever the name may be, it's not about the Muslim, it's not about the Christian, but it's about the person. And that would, that they'd perceive, that their walls would sort of come down, their prejudices too, and they'd say, hey, they're not interested at all, or it's not their main thing to evangelize us or to convert us, but they're interested in who we are, and that would go a long way, for dialogue and for friendship. Of course, it would be great if they become Christians, right? But it won't, it won't be in the traditional sense that we evangelize others, but this would be by witnessing through our lives, through how what I'm saying is that it would go a long way if we approach them as persons who are interested in our fellow persons.
Fantastic, Edgar. If we can sort of synthesize everything that we've learned down to one big lesson to take away for young Christians in the Western world today, what do you think you've gained from these conversations we've just listened to?
Yes, it was very encouraging to hear both from Anwar and Aldrin, to hear how Muslims are actually just people, normal people. As you and I, they have hopes and dreams and fears, and so we can relate to that. We can actually engage with them and have relationships with them. The fact that quote unquote we are Christians and they are Muslims doesn't mean that we can't have relationships. And so taking that barrier off to start with, to know that we can engage with them without necessarily having to be hostile, I think it is a good starting point for anyone who wants to just engage, and perhaps if they know someone from the community, and to actually start conversations, because that will make the path to further engagement, and maybe even in the future having conversations actually on religious beliefs.
Yeah, I think ultimately the theological position on engaging with Muslims is that it's just like engaging with anyone else. They're human beings made in the image of God, and just like us, they come with all the complexity and messiness and sinfulness and beauty that each of us come with. But it keeps coming back to, I think, the Good Samaritan, that the call is to love our enemies. And so no matter what history we might have with Islam, with Muslim people in our communities, we can extend a deep and gracious love because Christ first loved us. And ultimately, it's as simple as that.
Amen. Amen.
So, one thing that we want you to be aware of is that the work that Aldrin and Anwar do, the amazing work for the gospel, was made possible by their PhDs that they gained through the Langham Scholarship Program. This kind of work can only happen with your generous donations. It's just a reality of the world that we need money to do these projects. But as you can see, a little bit goes an incredibly long way to reach people of all faith backgrounds, all class distinctions and all ethnic backgrounds from every corner of the globe. We want to continue this wonderful project. And so we need your help. We'd really encourage you to consider donating generously to Langham with whatever you have. You can do that at au.langham.org/donate. Or if you'd like, we'll have a link down in the description below.
Awesome. And for the next episode, we are talking about justice. We are having this amazing conversation with this Palestinian-Israeli scholar, Johanna Catanaccio. And we will be speaking about justice, specifically what justice means in the context that Johanna finds himself in, which is a context of conflict. So please make sure that you tune in for the next episode.
And please remember to subscribe. Thank you so much for joining me this week, Edgar.
See you next time.
Bye.